The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Courtroom 3B, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. It was just another Tuesday at the county courthouse, and Judge William Harrison was already feeling the familiar weight of a busy day ahead. At 58 years old, he had been sitting on this bench for nearly 2 decades, and he prided himself on running one of the most efficient courtrooms in the building. Judge Harrison adjusted his black robes and glanced at the stack of files on his desk. 23 cases scheduled for today, ranging from traffic violations to small claims disputes. He liked order, routine, and most of all, he liked things to move quickly. Time was money, as he often said, and he had no patience for people who wasted either. The courtroom was already starting to fill up with the usual morning crowd. Defense attorneys shuffled through their briefcases, checking last-minute notes and whispering to their clients. A few police officers sat in the back rows, waiting to testify in various cases. The court reporter, Mrs. Chun, was setting up her equipment at her small desk beside the judge's bench. She had worked with Judge Harrison for 15 years and knew his moods better than most. Behind the defendant's table, a handful of people sat nervously in the gallery. Some were there for their own cases, others had come to support family members or friends. The atmosphere was tense but familiar, like the waiting room of a busy doctor's office where everyone hoped their turn would come and go without any complications. Judge Harrison took a sip of his black coffee and surveyed his domain. This was his courtroom, his rules, and he ran it exactly the way he wanted. He had a reputation for being tough but fair, though some of the younger attorneys whispered that he could be a bit harsh with people he felt weren't taking the proceedings seriously. Enough. The bailiff, Officer Rodriguez, stood near the side door, keeping an eye on everyone entering and leaving. He had worked courthouse security for 12 years and had seen every type of person imaginable walk through these doors. Drug dealers in expensive suits, grandmothers fighting parking tickets, teenagers who had made stupid mistakes, business owners settling disputes. The one thing he had learned was that you could never judge a book by its cover, though he noticed that some people, including judges, sometimes forgot that lesson. At exactly 9:15, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom opened. With a soft creak, a young woman entered quietly, her footsteps barely audible on the polished floor. She looked to be about 16 or 17 years old, with natural hair pulled back in a simple style. She wore dark jeans that had seen better days, white sneakers that were clean but clearly well worn, and a navy blue jacket that was practical rather than fashionable. The girl moved with purpose but without hurry, her eyes taking in the formal surroundings of the courtroom. She carried a small backpack and a manila folder tucked under one arm. To most people in the room, she looked like any other teenager who might be there for a minor offense or perhaps as a witness in some small case. Judge Harrison noticed her immediately, as he noticed everyone who entered his courtroom. His eyes followed her as she made her way toward the front of the room, and he found himself making quick assumptions about why she was there. Probably a shoplifting case, he thought to himself, or maybe she had been caught skipping school. These kids today had no respect for authority, and their parents weren't doing much better at teaching them proper behavior. The young woman approached the clerk's desk where Mrs. Patterson, the court clerk, was organizing paperwork for the morning's cases. The girl spoke quietly to Mrs. Patterson, too softly for anyone else to hear what she was saying. She showed Mrs. Patterson the contents of her manila folder, pointing to something on one of the documents. Mrs. Patterson looked at the papers for a moment, then glanced up at Judge Harrison's bench. She seemed slightly confused and asked the girl a question. The young woman nodded and pulled out what appeared to be an official letter with some kind of seal on it. Judge Harrison was getting impatient. He didn't like side conversations during court hours, especially when he couldn't hear what was being discussed. The morning calendar was full enough without unnecessary delays, and he wanted to get started with the first case. He tapped his pen against his desk, a sound that usually got people's attention and let them know he was ready to begin. The girl at the clerk's desk was still talking quietly with Mrs. Patterson, showing her more documents from her folder. Judge Harrison could see that Mrs. Patterson was reading something carefully, Her eyebrows raised slightly as if she was surprised by what she was seeing in the gallery. A few of the regular attorneys who appeared in Judge Harrison's court frequently were settling into their seats. Among them was attorney Lisa Santos, a criminal defense lawyer who had been practicing for 20 years. She knew Judge Harrison well and understood his personality. He was generally fair in his rulings, but he could be impatient with people he felt were unprepared or disrespectful. She had seen him lecture defendants about their life choices more than once, sometimes going beyond what was necessary for the case at hand. The young woman finally finished her conversation with Mrs. Patterson and turned toward the seating area. As she did, she made brief eye contact with Judge Harrison. Her expression was calm and professional, not at all what the judge expected from someone he assumed was there as a defendant. Most young people in her situation looked nervous, scared, or defiant. This girl looked confident and composed, which somehow irritated him even more. She found a seat in the third row, placing her backpack on the floor beside her and keeping the manila folder on her lap. She sat with perfect posture, her hands folded, watching the proceedings with what appeared to be genuine interest, rather than the usual anxiety or boredom that most people displayed in court. Judge Harrison couldn't shake the feeling that something was different about this girl, though he couldn't put his finger on what it was. She didn't fit his mental picture of the typical teenager who ended up in his courtroom. There was something about her bearing, her clothes, the way she carried herself that seemed almost professional. But he dismissed these thoughts quickly. At her age, and dressed the way she was probably just another kid who had gotten into trouble and was trying to make a good impression on the judge. The clock on the wall showed 9:25, and Judge Harrison was ready to begin the day's proceedings. He had no idea that this seemingly ordinary Tuesday morning was about to become one of the most memorable and embarrassing days of his entire career on the bench. The young woman sitting quietly in his courtroom was not who he thought she was, and the assumptions he was making would soon come back to haunt him in ways he never could have imagined. Judge Harrison banged his gavel once, the sharp sound echoing through the courtroom. "Court is now in session," he announced in his deep, authoritative voice. He looked down at his calendar, ready to call the first case, when he noticed the young woman from earlier stand up and begin walking toward the front of the courtroom. She moved with the same quiet confidence she had shown when she first entered, her manila folder still clutched in her hand. As she approached the area near the judge's bench, Judge Harrison felt his irritation growing. The morning hadn't even officially started, and already someone was disrupting his carefully planned schedule. "Excuse me, Your Honor," the young woman said politely, her voice clear and respectful. "I was wondering if I could speak with you for just a moment about—" Judge Harrison held up his hand, cutting her off mid-sentence. His face showed the kind of expression that courthouse regulars knew meant trouble. The friendly conversation from earlier between her and the clerk had already put him in a bad mood, and now she was approaching his bench without being called. "Hold on there, young lady," he said, his tone sharp and dismissive. "I don't know what you think this is, but this is a courtroom, not a chat room. You don't just walk up here and start talking whenever you feel like it." The girl stopped where she was, about 10 feet from the bench, and tried again. "I understand that, Your Honor. I just need to explain why I'm here today. If I could just show you this letter—" "Listen," Judge Harrison interrupted again, leaning forward in his chair and pointing his pen at her like a weapon. "I've been doing this for 20 years, and I can spot trouble from a mile away. You're here because you got yourself into some kind of mess, right? Shoplifting? Truancy? Fighting at school?" The young woman blinked, clearly taken aback by his assumptions. "No, sir, that's not why I'm here at all. If you would just let me explain." But Judge Harrison was just getting started. He had decided that this teenager needed a lecture, and he was going to give her one whether she wanted it or not. "Don't know, sir, me. I can see exactly what's going on here. You come waltzing into my courtroom dressed like you're going to the mall, probably thinking you can just charm your way out of whatever trouble you've gotten yourself into." Several people in the courtroom began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. Attorney Santos, who had been reviewing her notes for an upcoming case, looked up with concern. She had seen Judge Harrison be stern before, but this was different. The girl hadn't even been accused of anything yet, and he was already treating her like a convicted criminal. The young woman took a deep breath, clearly trying to maintain her composure. "Your Honor, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Not here as a defendant. I'm here because you thought you could just walk in here and waste everyone's time," Judge Harrison snapped. "Let me guess, this is your first time in court and you have no idea how things work. Well, let me educate you. This is a place of law and order, not some playground where you can just do whatever you want." Mrs. Chung, the court reporter, glanced up from her machine with a worried expression. In all her years working with Judge Harrison, she had never seen him this aggressive with someone who hadn't even been charged with anything. She wondered if she should say something, but court reporters were supposed to remain neutral and quiet. During proceedings, the bailiff, Officer Rodriguez, was also watching the exchange with growing concern. The young woman clearly wasn't a threat to anyone, and she was being more polite and respectful than many of the actual defendants he had seen over the years. Something about this situation felt wrong, but he wasn't sure if he should intervene. "Judge." Harrison continued his lecture, his voice getting louder and more condescending with each word. "Look at yourself, jeans and sneakers in my courtroom. Do you think this is appropriate attire for a court of law? Where are your parents? Are they even aware that you're here, or did you just decide to skip school and cause trouble somewhere else?" The girl's jaw tightened slightly, but she maintained her respectful tone. "Your Honor, my clothing is perfectly appropriate for why I'm here today. And yes, my family knows exactly where I am. If you would just look at this letter—" "I don't need to look at anything," Judge Harrison cut her off again. "What I need is for you to sit down, be quiet, and wait your turn like everyone else. This courtroom operates on order and respect, two things you clearly know nothing about." Attorney Santos finally stood up from her seat. She couldn't watch this unfair treatment continue any longer. "Your Honor, perhaps we should allow the young lady to explain why she's here before making any assumptions about her character or her reasons for being in court." Judge Harrison turned his attention to the attorney, his face flushing red with anger. "Ms. Santos, I don't recall asking for your opinion on how I should run my courtroom. This young woman clearly needs to learn some basic respect and proper procedures, and I'm going to make sure she gets that lesson today." The tension in the courtroom was becoming unbearable. Several people in the gallery were whispering to each other, wondering what was happening and why the judge was being so harsh with someone who seemed to be trying to be respectful and cooperative. The young woman stood perfectly still, her folder still in her hand, waiting for an opportunity to speak. Her calm demeanor seemed to only make Judge Harrison more angry. He had expected her to become defensive or emotional, which would have justified his harsh treatment in his mind. Instead, her composure made him look like a bully picking on someone who was clearly trying to follow proper procedures. "You know what your problem is?" Judge Harrison continued, now fully committed to his lecture. "You young people today think the rules don't apply to you. You think you can just show up anywhere and demand attention. Well, that's not how the real world works, especially not in my courtroom." He paused to take a drink of his coffee, giving the young woman what appeared to be another chance to speak. But when she opened her mouth to try again, he immediately cut her off. "And another thing," he said, pointing his finger at her again, "that attitude of yours isn't going to get you anywhere in life. Walking around like you own the place, thinking you're smarter than everyone else. Let me tell you something, young lady. Respect is earned, not demanded." The irony of his words was lost on Judge Harrison, but it wasn't lost on anyone else in the courtroom. Here he was, demanding respect while showing absolutely none to the young woman standing before him. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't been disrespectful, and hadn't done anything to deserve the treatment she was receiving. Mrs. Patterson, the court clerk, was watching the scene unfold with growing horror. She knew exactly why the young woman was there because she had seen the official documents. But Judge Harrison was so caught up in his assumptions and his lecture that he wouldn't let anyone explain the situation. The young woman finally managed to speak. During a brief pause, Your Honor, I completely understand the importance of respect and proper procedures in a courtroom. That's exactly why I'm trying to follow the correct protocol by— Don't you dare lecture me about protocol, Judge Harrison snapped. I've been practicing law since before you were born. I know what protocol looks like, and this isn't it. Protocol is coming to court prepared, dressed appropriately, and showing proper respect to the judicial system. The courtroom had fallen completely silent except for Judge Harrison's voice. Everyone was watching this bizarre scene unfold, unable to believe what they were witnessing. The young woman remained standing calmly, but those paying close attention could see that her patience was beginning to wear thin, not with anger, but with disappointment at the way she was being treated. The young woman took a slow, deliberate breath before responding to Judge Harrison's latest outburst. Her voice remained steady and professional, which only seemed to fuel his growing anger. Your Honor, I apologize if my presence has caused any confusion. I'm simply trying to present the proper documentation that explains why I'm here today. She held up the manila folder slightly, hoping he would finally allow her to show him the contents. But Judge Harrison wasn't interested in looking at any papers. In his mind, he had already figured out everything he needed to know about this teenager. Documentation? He scoffed, leaning back in his chair with a dismissive laugh. Let me guess, a note from your school counselor? A letter from your parents making excuses for your behavior? I've seen it all before, sweetheart, and none of it impresses me. The word sweetheart hung in the air like a slap. Several people in the courtroom visibly cringed at the condescending tone. Mrs. Chun, the court reporter, actually paused her, typing for a moment, wondering if she had heard correctly. In all her years of recording court proceedings, she had never heard a judge address someone with such obvious disrespect. The young woman's composure was remarkable. Instead of getting angry or defensive, she simply nodded and said, I understand your concerns. Your Honor, however, I believe if you would review these documents, you would see that I'm here in an official capacity that has been pre-approved by the state judicial system. This response seemed to catch Judge Harrison off guard for a moment. Her formal language and calm demeanor didn't match his mental picture of a troubled teenager trying to talk her way out of trouble. But instead of pausing to reconsider his assumptions, he doubled down on his aggressive approach. Official capacity? He repeated mockingly. What are you, some kind of junior lawyer? Did you watch a few episodes of a legal drama and decide you could come into my courtroom and use fancy words to impress me? A few people in the gallery exchanged shocked glances. Attorney Santos shifted in her seat, clearly uncomfortable with where this was heading. She had seen Judge Harrison be tough before, but this level of sarcasm and mockery toward someone who hadn't been accused of any wrongdoing was completely inappropriate. The young woman maintained her professional stance. No, Your Honor, I'm not claiming to be a lawyer. I'm here as part of an educational program that has been approved by your court system. The documentation I'm carrying explains everything. Educational program, Judge Harrison repeated with another laugh. Is that what they're calling community service these days? Or maybe this is some kind of scared straight program for kids who think they're too smart for their own good. Behind the defendant's table, a public defender named Attorney Williams was watching the exchange with growing alarm. He had appeared before Judge Harrison dozens of times and had never seen him behave this way. The judge was clearly making assumptions based on the young woman's appearance and age, and those assumptions were leading him down a very dangerous path. Officer Rodriguez, the bailiff, was also becoming increasingly uncomfortable. He had dealt with actual troublemakers and disrespectful defendants countless times, and this young woman wasn't behaving like any of them. She was polite, articulate, and clearly trying to follow proper procedures. Yet the judge was treating her worse than most actual criminals who came through his courtroom. The young woman tried one more time to redirect the conversation. Your Honor, I believe there may be some confusion about why I'm here. I'm not a defendant, and I'm not here for any kind of disciplinary action. I'm participating in a judicial observation program, and I have all the proper authorization. Judge Harrison's face was getting redder by the minute. The fact that this teenager was maintaining her composure while he was clearly losing his was making him even more angry. In his mind, she should have been intimidated, apologetic, or at least flustered by his authoritative presence. Instead, she was speaking to him like an equal, which he found absolutely unacceptable. "Listen here, little girl," he said, his voice rising to a level that made several people in the courtroom flinch. "I don't care what kind of program you think you're in or what kind of authorization you think you have. What I care about is respect, and you clearly don't have any." He stood up from his chair, using his height and position to try to intimidate her. "You walk into my courtroom dressed like you're going to a basketball game. You interrupt my proceedings without being called, and then you have the nerve to stand there and argue with me about procedures. That tells me everything I need to know about your character." The young woman didn't step back or show any signs of being intimidated. She simply nodded and said, "I respect your position, Your Honor, and I respect this courtroom. That's exactly why I'm trying to follow the proper channels to explain my presence here today." Her continued politeness seemed to infuriate Judge Harrison even more. He had expected her to either break down in tears or lash out in anger, either of which would have justified his harsh treatment in his mind. Instead, she was making him look like a bully who was picking on someone who was clearly trying to be respectful and cooperative. Attorney Santos had heard enough. She stood up slowly, her chair creaking in the otherwise silent courtroom. "Your Honor, if I may," she began carefully, knowing she was taking a significant risk by challenging the judge. "Perhaps we should allow the young lady to present whatever documentation she has before making any judgments about why she's here." Judge Harrison whirled around to face the attorney, his eyes blazing with anger. "Miss Santos, I warned you once already about interfering in matters that don't concern you. This is my courtroom, and I'll handle this situation however I see fit." "I understand that, Your Honor," Attorney Santos replied, trying to keep her voice calm and professional. "I am simply suggesting that we follow standard procedure and allow her to state her business before the court." "Standard procedure?" Judge Harrison's voice was now loud enough to be heard clearly in the hallway outside the courtroom. "I'll tell you what standard procedure is. Standard procedure is showing respect for the court, coming prepared and properly dressed, and not wasting everyone's time with nonsense." He turned back to the young woman, who was still standing patiently near the bench. "And you," he said, pointing at her again, "need to learn that this world doesn't revolve around you. You can't just show up wherever you want and expect people to drop everything to listen to your stories." Mrs. Patterson, the court clerk, was frantically trying to catch Judge Harrison's attention without being obvious about it. She knew exactly what was in the young woman's folder because she had seen the official seal and letterhead. If the judge would just calm down for 2 seconds and look at the documentation, this entire embarrassing scene could be resolved immediately, but Judge Harrison was too caught up in his lecture to notice the clerk's attempts to get his attention. He was on a roll now, and he seemed determined to make sure everyone in the courtroom understood who was in charge. "You know what I think?" he continued, his voice dripping with condescension. "I think you're here because you got caught doing something you shouldn't have been doing, and now you're trying to snow me with all this talk about programs and documentation. Well, let me tell you something. I've been fooled by smooth talkers before, and I'm not about to let it happen again." The young woman remained silent for a moment, clearly gathering her thoughts. When she spoke again, her voice was still respectful, but there was a slight edge to it that hadn't been there before. "Your Honor, I understand that you deal with many different types of cases and people in your courtroom. However, I assure you that I am here for legitimate reasons, and I have the proper authority to be here." "Authority?" Judge Harrison laughed bitterly. "The only authority in this courtroom is me, and I'm telling you that you need to sit down, be quiet, and wait your turn like everyone else. And if you can't do that, then Officer Rodriguez here will be happy to escort you out of my courtroom." The bailiff looked extremely uncomfortable at being brought into the situation. He had no desire to remove someone who clearly wasn't causing any real problems, but he also couldn't openly defy the judge's instructions. The atmosphere in the courtroom had become so tense that people were actually holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Everyone could sense that this situation was spiraling out of control, but no one knew how to stop it without making things worse. The courtroom had become so quiet that the only sounds were the soft hum of the air conditioning and the occasional creak of wooden chairs as people shifted nervously in their seats. Everyone could feel that something big was about to happen, but no one knew exactly what. Judge Harrison stood behind his bench, breathing heavily from his outburst, still pointing an accusatory finger at the young woman. His face was flushed red with anger, and small beads of sweat had formed on his forehead despite the cool temperature in the room. He was clearly waiting for her to either break down crying or storm out of the courtroom in defeat, but the young woman did neither. Instead, she took a step forward and looked directly up at Judge Harrison with a calm, steady gaze that somehow seemed to fill the entire room with tension. For the first time since this whole confrontation began, she didn't try to interrupt him or ask permission to speak. She simply waited until she was absolutely certain he was finished with his rant. When the silence stretched on for several long seconds, she finally spoke. Her voice was clear, strong, and loud enough for every single person in the courtroom to hear every word she said. "Your Honor," she began, her tone still respectful but now carrying a weight and authority that hadn't been there before. "My name is Zara Mitchell." She paused for just a moment, letting her name sink in, before continuing. "I am the recipient of this year's Chief Justice Award for Outstanding Young Legal Mind, presented by the State Supreme Court of this jurisdiction." Judge Harrison's pointing finger slowly lowered as confusion began to replace the anger on his face. Several people in the gallery sat up straighter in their chairs, suddenly paying much closer attention to what was happening. "I am here today," Zara continued, her voice growing stronger with each word, "as an invited observer participating in a judicial research program that has been personally approved by Chief Justice Reynolds and the State Supreme Court Administrative Office." She held up the manila folder that she had been trying to show him for the past 20 minutes. "The documentation I have been attempting to present to you includes an official invitation letter bearing the State Supreme Court seal, my research credentials from Harvard Law School's Advanced Youth Legal Studies program, and written authorization for my presence in courtrooms throughout this district." The color was beginning to drain from Judge Harrison's face as the full implications of what she was saying started to sink in. Mrs. Patterson, the court clerk, was nodding vigorously from her desk, trying to signal to the judge that everything the young woman was saying was true, but Zara wasn't finished. She took another step forward, her composure absolutely unshakable. "I am also conducting research on unconscious bias and discriminatory practices in the American judicial system, with particular focus on how assumptions based on age, race, and appearance can affect courtroom interactions and the administration of justice." Attorney Santos's jaw dropped open. She had heard of the Harvard program and knew that only the most exceptional young legal minds in the country were accepted into it. The realization of what had just happened was slowly dawning on everyone in the courtroom. "Furthermore," Zara continued, her voice now carrying the weight of someone who clearly knew exactly what she was talking about, "I am the daughter of Federal Judge Patricia Mitchell of the United States District Court for the Eastern District, and the granddaughter of Civil Rights Attorney James Mitchell, who argued 3 cases before the United States Supreme Court during the 1960s. The silence in the courtroom was now absolutely deafening. Judge Harrison's mouth had fallen open, and he was gripping the edge of his bench so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. The full magnitude of his mistake was crashing down on him like a freight train. Zara reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out what appeared to be a small recording device. "In accordance with the laws of this state, which allow for the recording of public judicial proceedings, I've been documenting courtroom interactions as part of my research. The past 25 minutes of this conversation have been recorded and will be included in my analysis of judicial conduct and bias patterns." Officer Rodriguez, the bailiff, actually took a step backward, his eyes wide with shock. He had worked in law enforcement long enough to know that whatever had just happened was going to have serious consequences for everyone involved. Mrs. Chun, the court reporter, had stopped typing entirely and was staring at her machine as if she couldn't believe what she had just recorded. Years of courtroom experience had taught her to remain neutral and professional, but even she was struggling to maintain her composure in the face of this stunning revelation. Judge Harrison finally found his voice, though it came out as barely. More than a whisper. You're Judge Mitchell's daughter? Yes, Your Honor, Zara replied calmly. And before you ask, yes, my mother is aware of where I am today and what I'm researching. In fact, she encouraged me to pursue this project because she believes that the only way to improve our justice system is to honestly examine its flaws and work to correct them. She opened her manila folder and pulled out an official-looking document with an impressive seal at the top. This letter, signed by Chief Justice Reynolds himself, formally welcomes me to observe proceedings in any courtroom within this district. It also explains the nature and importance of my research project. Judge Harrison reached out with a shaking hand to take the letter, but his movements were so unsteady that Zara had to step closer to the bench to hand it to him properly. As he read the document, his face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, horror, and finally, complete devastation as he realized what he had done. The letter was exactly what Zara had said it was. It praised her academic achievements, outlined her research project, and specifically requested that all court personnel provide her with full cooperation and respect during her observations. At the bottom, in addition to the Chief Justice signature, was a personal note recommending her as one of the most promising young legal minds of her generation. Attorney Santos was shaking her head in disbelief. She had witnessed judicial misconduct before, but never anything quite this spectacular. A sitting judge had just spent 25 minutes berating, mocking, and making racist assumptions about someone who was essentially a VIP guest of the state court system. Your Honor, Zara said, her voice still calm but now carrying an edge of disappointment that was somehow more cutting than anger would have been. I want you to know that when I began my research, I was hoping to find examples of fair and unbiased judicial conduct that I could highlight as positive examples in my final report. She paused to let that sink in before continuing. I was particularly interested in observing your courtroom because of your reputation for efficiency and fairness. Unfortunately, the interaction we've just had will serve as a different kind of example entirely. Judge Harrison was now sitting heavily in his chair, the letter still clutched in his trembling hands. He looked like a man who had just watched his entire career flash before his eyes. And in many ways, that's exactly what was happening. I want to make something very clear, Zara continued, addressing not just the judge, but the entire courtroom. This is not about revenge or trying to destroy anyone's career. This is about understanding how unconscious bias affects our legal system and finding ways to make it better for everyone. She turned to look at the people in the gallery, many of whom were still staring at her in amazement. What happened here? Today happens in courtrooms across America every single day. People are judged not by their words or actions, but by their appearance, their age, their race, or their economic status. My research is aimed at helping the legal community recognize these patterns and develop better training to prevent them. When she turned back to Judge Harrison, there was something almost compassionate in her expression, despite everything he had just put her through. Your Honor, I hope that this experience will serve as a learning opportunity, not just for you, but for everyone who hears about it. The law is supposed to be blind to these kinds of differences, but the people who administer it are not. And until we acknowledge that fact and work to address it, we can never truly achieve justice for all. The weight of her words hung in the air like a challenge and an invitation at the same time. Judge Harrison knew that his world was about to change forever, and there was absolutely nothing he could do to stop it. The silence that followed Zara's revelation seemed to stretch on forever. Judge Harrison sat frozen in his chair, staring down at the official letter in his hands as if he couldn't quite believe what he was reading. His face had gone from red, with anger, to completely pale, and small beads of sweat were now visible on his forehead. Despite the cool temperature in the courtroom, Attorney Santos was the first person to move. She slowly stood up from her seat, gathered her papers, and walked toward the front of the courtroom. Your Honor, she said quietly, I believe it would be appropriate to call a recess at this time. Judge Harrison looked up at her with the expression of a man who had just been hit by a truck. He nodded weakly and managed to say, Court is in recess for 30 minutes. His voice was barely audible, completely different from the booming, authoritative tone he had been using just minutes earlier. As people began to file out of the courtroom, many of them were whispering to each other and glancing back at Zara with a mixture of amazement and respect. Word of what had just happened was already starting to spread through the courthouse hallways like wildfire. Mrs. Patterson, the court clerk, hurried over to where Zara was standing. I am so sorry, she said, her voice filled with genuine regret. I tried to get his attention when you first showed me your papers, but he wouldn't listen. I should have spoken up louder. Zara smiled kindly at the older woman. You have nothing to apologize for, Mrs. Patterson. You were trying to help, and I appreciate that. This situation has actually provided me with exactly the kind of data I was looking for, though I certainly didn't expect it to be quite this dramatic. Meanwhile, Judge Harrison had finally stood up from his chair, but he seemed unsteady on his feet. Officer Rodriguez moved closer to the bench, not because he thought the judge was a threat to anyone, but because he was genuinely concerned that the man might collapse from shock. Your Honor, the bailiff said quietly, maybe you should sit down for a few minutes. This has been a lot to process. Judge Harrison nodded and slumped back into his chair. For the first time in his 20-year career, he had absolutely no idea what to do next. He had made mistakes before, certainly, but nothing even close to this magnitude. He had just publicly humiliated himself while treating a distinguished guest of the court system with shocking disrespect. And it had all been recorded. Outside in the hallway, Attorney Santos was already on her phone with a colleague. You're not going to believe what just happened in Harrison's courtroom, she was saying. No, seriously, you need to hear this. A teenage girl just completely schooled him, and it turns out she's Judge Mitchell's daughter doing research for Harvard. Within 20 minutes, news of the incident had reached the courthouse administrator's office. Within an hour, it had made its way to the Chief Justice's chambers. By the end of the day, every judge, attorney, and court employee in the building had heard some version of the story. Zara, meanwhile, had remained in the courtroom during the recess, calmly organizing her notes and reviewing the recording she had made. She wasn't gloating or celebrating her victory over Judge Harrison. Instead, she was thinking about how to use this experience constructively in her research. When Attorney Santos approached her, Zara looked up with a professional smile. I want to thank you for trying to intervene earlier, she said. That took courage, and it shows that there are people in this system who are willing to stand up for what's right. I should have done more, Attorney Santos replied, shaking her head. I've been practicing in front of Judge Harrison for years, and I've never seen him behave that way. But I should have been more forceful in stopping it. You did what you could within the constraints of the system, Zara said thoughtfully. And that's actually part of what my research is examining. How do power dynamics in courtrooms prevent people from speaking up when they see injustice happening? Your experience today will be valuable data for that analysis. When court reconvened 30 minutes later, Judge Harrison looked like a completely different person. His usual confident demeanor had been replaced by obvious anxiety and uncertainty. He avoided making eye contact with anyone as he took his seat behind the bench. Before we proceed with today's calendar, he began, his voice shaky and uncertain, I need to make a formal apology to Ms. Mitchell for my completely inappropriate behavior earlier this morning. My conduct was unprofessional, disrespectful, and entirely unacceptable for a member of the judiciary. He paused, clearly struggling with what to say next. I allowed my assumptions and biases to cloud my judgment, and I treated a distinguished guest of our court system with shocking disrespect. There is no excuse for my behavior, and I take full responsibility for my actions. Zara stood up from her seat in the gallery. Thank you for that apology, Your Honor. I accept it, and I hope that we can all learn from this experience. But Judge Harrison's problems were just beginning. By the end of that week, formal complaints had been filed with the State Judicial Conduct Board. The Chief Justice had called for a full investigation into the incident. Local legal newspapers were already writing articles about judicial bias and the need for better training programs. The recording that Zara had made became a centerpiece of her research presentation to the state Supreme Court 2 months later. She didn't use it to embarrass Judge Harrison further, but rather as an example of how unconscious bias can affect even experienced legal professionals who consider themselves fair and impartial. What happened in that courtroom wasn't unique, she told the assembled justices during her presentation. It was just more dramatic and more well-documented than usual. Every day, assumptions are made about people based on their appearance, their age, their race, or their economic status. The only difference in this case was that I had the credentials and the recording equipment to prove what had happened. Her research led to significant changes in the state's judicial education program. Old judges were now required to undergo annual bias training, with real-world examples and interactive scenarios designed to help them recognize their own unconscious prejudices. Judge Harrison himself became an unlikely advocate for these reforms. After undergoing extensive counseling and bias training, he began speaking at judicial education conferences about his experience and the importance of checking assumptions at the courthouse door. "I thought I was a fair judge," he would tell audiences of his peers. "I thought I treated everyone equally. But one Tuesday morning, a 16-year-old girl taught me that good intentions aren't enough. We have to actively work to recognize and counter our biases, because they're always there whether we want to admit it or not." 6 months after the incident, Zara's research paper was published in the Harvard Law Review, bringing national attention to the issue of judicial bias. Her work led to similar training programs being implemented in courts across the country. The most satisfying outcome for Zara, however, came a year later when she received a letter from a young man who had appeared before Judge Harrison in a minor traffic case. The man wrote that he had been dreading his court appearance because of his appearance and background, but that Judge Harrison had treated him with complete respect and fairness. "I don't know what changed him," the letter said. "But whatever it was, it made a real difference in how I was treated. For the first time in my life, I felt like the system actually worked the way it was supposed to." Zara kept that letter in her desk drawer as a reminder that real change was possible, even in systems that seemed resistant to improvement. Her experience in Judge Harrison's courtroom had been difficult and frustrating, but it had also proven that one person with courage and conviction could make a difference. The legal community had learned an important lesson that day: respect and fairness aren't just nice ideas to talk about in law school classrooms. They're essential principles that must be actively practiced every single day, with every single person who walks through the courthouse doors. And sometimes the most important lessons come from the people you least expect to teach them.